Why don't we go ahead and get started? Sam, I will just let you run with it. Welcome, everybody, and we'll hand it off.
Welcome. So we're not doing intros? Yes?
Nope. I think it's a pretty big group. Why don't
Okay.
you do an intro, and anybody else from the Great Expectations team or anybody y'all brought with you? But
awesome. Yeah, sounds good. Let's do that. So hey, I'm Sam. I'm at Superconductive as, I don't know, James, what is my title now? We've just restructured our engineering team.
I do something. This puts you in a great position to like get your favorite new title.
Can I just give myself a title? VP of Getting Shit Done. I think that was my former CTO's title, actually. So I am do engineering, management, partnerships at Superconductive. I've been at Superconductive since the beginning of this year, was at Flatiron Health. Before that, for about 5.5 years, some people might have heard of them, pretty big healthcare data startup. So I have suffered from really, really awful third-party data for multiple years, which made me join Superconductive to hopefully do something about poor data quality. And with me today, I have Kyle and James, if you want to intro yourself.
Sure, I'm James Campbell. I am the CTO at Superconductive and one of the original folks who worked on Great Expectations. I spent most of my career in the US intelligence community and joined Superconductive about 1.5 years ago after working a little bit on some of the back ideas for GE. For me, like the long-term interests are all around the human-machine collaboration and the ability to communicate, understand and communicate uncertainty effectively. So I love where we're going with GE and the ability to do that. So I get to geek out about that stuff now all the time, which is a blast.
All right, I'll intro. Thanks, James and Sam. Kyle, I am the community manager over at the GE Slack. I'm also the user experience designer, and I'm doing a lot of our like marketing and growth and things like that. So I'm sharing, our articles around. I'm mixing it up with different communities. You'll probably just see me popping around, and I'll be if you come into our Slack, might check in with you and say hello. That's me.
All right. So I am going to do about 15 or so minutes about Great Expectations. It's mostly just like somewhat higher level overview, but we have plenty of time for Q&A, and feel free to stop me if you have any questions and just ask. I think the group is small enough to just take questions on the spot. I might just defer to later if they're a little more substantial or if I'm going to cover them. So let's get started. Let me share my screen here. Cool. Oh man, so many windows. All right. I think the first question would actually be, how many people here have heard of Great Expectations or have actually played around with it? Okay, I see 4 hands up, 5, 6. Okay, that's a pretty, and 1 thumbs up. So there's about half of the people here. So that's really awesome. That's super exciting. So hopefully you'll learn something new or get a different perspective on that. And hopefully for the people who haven't actually used Great Expectations yet, you'll kind of get a good understanding of what it is and why it might actually be interesting. Cool. This. Awesome. All right. So first of all, hello again from Superconductive. So Superconductive is the core maintainer team behind Great Expectations. We're all data people of sorts from different backgrounds. Few of us are in healthcare. So we've done the healthcare tech thing together and struggled through that. A bunch of e-commerce, wearables. So and then James obviously from different areas. So lots of data people, and we all care a lot about data quality. This is a screenshot. This is not everyone at the company right now, but almost all of us at our last happy hour / intern farewell were Ben, who's now doing customer success, was actually playing some music for our intern to wish him farewell. So we're actually entirely remote, which is cool. I joined January this year, so had about a month or so before we went into lockdown. And I was like, oh, great, we're already used to working remotely. I'm based in New York City. James is in North Carolina. Got a bunch of people on the West Coast, Silicon Valley, Bay Area, bunch of people in Salt Lake City. Kyle is up in Ann Arbor, I think, right now. So we're pretty distributed over the whole the United States. And like I said, we're the core sort of maintainers by Great Expectations, the open source project. So what is Great Expectations? The challenge that we're trying to cover is, I am sharing the screen, right? You're seeing my slides, just checking. Okay, perfect. The challenge that we're trying to tackle is that data workflows nowadays are a little bit of a mess. So data pipelines are often brittle. They fail, they can fail loudly, which is good sometimes. They can also fail silently, which is usually really unpleasant and unwanted. In terms of the knowledge about the data, it's usually scattered among domain experts, there's technical experts, there's the code, there's the data itself that, oh, of course, it's self-explanatory, but it really isn't. And a lot of times knowing about your data, especially if you're integrating with third-party data, is a little bit of tribal knowledge, anecdotes, and people who happen to know something about something because they found it out once, but no one really knows the data sort of inside out, and there's no usually formal way of documenting all that knowledge. So maintenance of data pipelines often becomes time-consuming, expensive, and morale-killing. I myself, as I mentioned, was on a data engineering team where we would do daily data ingestions from healthcare data, and we pretty much had issues every single day because something would always change. So the key problem we're really trying to address is that trust in many data systems is really low. And if you contrast that with software engineering, it's actually really interesting to see how data is kind of so far behind software engineering, where if we had all these problems with software engineering, nowadays where we'd say, oh, software is unreliable and brittle and no one has knowledge about it, we'd have more severe problems than we have. I feel like, at least with software engineering, we have a pretty good grasp on a lot of those issues that we still see in data. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to use a little bit of an example, super straightforward toy example, just to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. So let's assume we have a typical data pipeline where we get, let's say, a monthly data refresh. The example I'm using is the New York City taxi ride data. And usually what happens if you have some form of ETL pipeline, so get the data from somewhere, CSV files or whatever, you put those into your data warehouse. Maybe there's some transformation, some data cleaning, and then you have your data products that you feed off of that data. Let's say we're looking at the number of passengers per taxi ride in New York City or any other statistics. And one example of those kinds of metrics is, let's look at the number of passengers per ride in our, let's say, January 2019 data set, where we can pretty clearly see the majority of taxi rides has only one passengers, and it kind of goes down. And we have very few rides that actually have 0 passengers, which makes a lot of sense. Why would those be tracked? And then let's assume we are actually integrating our February data, and all of a sudden we have a little bit of a spike in the number of 0 passenger taxi rides. And just based on our domain knowledge, based on what we know about taxi rides, this seems unusual. And also based on what we've seen in our previous data, this kind of seems out of whack. So what happened? And this is really, I've done a lot of user interviews in the past few months at Superconductive, and this is really like a common theme that I think everyone who's on a data team has to deal with, is that our stakeholders notice data issues or data problems before we do. And that really erodes trust in the data, in our team. It's really stressful. We just have no grasp on those kinds of problems. And that's exactly what we're trying to address. So one example, and of course everyone here is in data, so this is very heavily simplified and only one example of how you could do data pipelines, is instead of pumping your monthly data refresh straight into your data warehouse and then building your data, your dashboards off of it. You could, for example, load it into a staging environment, which could also be the same database. It doesn't matter what the staging environment is physically, and then actually run some data validation on it to see, does that data actually make sense that we're ingesting? And depending on the results of that data validation, you could either then promote your data to a production environment, or you could throw some alerts, halt your pipelines, have people actually look at that. This is really just one example of data validation in a data pipeline. Obviously, there's a lot of other places where you would want validation. I'm just using this as an example. Hey, and this is where Great Expectations comes in. So yeah, hi.
So hi. On this staging environment, do you actually mean as in like, so in software development, there's like staging production environments. Is that what you mean for like a staging environment, or do you mean as like a landing zone before data goes into production?
Yeah. I'm thinking of it more of a landing zone of you don't just integrate the CSV and append that to your overall data of all data, to your table of all times, but you do something with that CSV to validate it before you put it into your production environment, or before you add it to your approved and signed off data set. Again, this whole concept of a staging environment, like I'm just using it as sort of there are some checks up front. What that implementation looks like is entirely up to obviously the pipelines and the needs of that particular application. Does that answer your question?
It does answer my question. I just wonder if the language around like staging versus something else with a landing zone would be more helpful. But
yeah, I've definitely used the word staging for.
I have too. I've been gotten confused.
Yeah, I really like landing zone of like, yeah, the thinking of it in terms of like the clean rooms, like where you have to get through like one room when you have like your hazmat suit and you get like steamed or whatever it is. That's sort of what I have in mind for it. Okay, let's move on. So like I said, the validation aspect. So again, staging, non-staging, landing zone, whatever it is, Great Expectations specifically focus on the actual validation aspect of that sort of workflow. And in this case, I'm actually jumping right to the end and showing you an output of Great Expectations. So this is what we call data docs. It's an HTML report. A lot of our users just call it like reports. The reports. So this is a report of the tests that you've run with Great Expectations. And in this particular case, I can see that my test suite has failed. And I'm also going to show you why, because I had some tests, some expectations that the values in my passenger count column must be between 1 and 6. And we found too many of those zero values, too many values that violated that expectation. So we have an error and our tests failed. If you're familiar with software like development and writing tests like PyTest or whatever, it's very much equivalent to that in the sense that you have a bunch of tests that run, and then each individual test can pass and fail, and your test suite can pass and fail based on that. So I'm going to rewind from here and actually show you what Great Expectations looks like behind the scenes. So first of all, what is Great Expectations? You probably know this by now. It's an open source Python library, which you can easily just pip install. What the initialization step does when you initialize a Great Expectations project, or what we call a data context, it basically creates a little bit of a directory scaffold that contains, most importantly, the Great Expectations.yaml, so a configuration file where you configure your data sources, so what kind of data you want to connect to. You configure what we call stores, which is where are the expectations, the actual test stores, where's the validation result output stores, where are your generated data docs stored, so you can configure all of that in your Great Expectations YAML. And then the other thing that's probably interesting is that we have a directory called expectations, and you have your expectation suite are stored as JSON files. So we have a process where you basically create an expectation suite, it gets serialized as JSON, and then at some other point in time, you can load that suite and use it to validate a batch of data. going to show that in a second. So the question is, I've used the word expectation before, and I hope it kind of just, like the definition of an expectation just kind of falls out of what I've just been talking about. An expectation is a statement about what we expect from our data. We could call it an assertion, a test, and it's expressed as a method in Python, in that Python library that we have. So in this case, in this example, I have a very simple expectation that says expect column values to be between, and I'm just specifying my column, and then I'm specifying my range, min value, max value. And like I said, that gets serialized, it's JSON, and then in our data docs, it can also be rendered as a human readable output. So the idea behind data docs is really, and the idea behind Great Expectations is that you don't just have your tests in code, kind of the way you have with like PyTest, for example, but you actually have a really cool report and a human readable interface for non-technical or less technical users who can basically see your expectation suites almost as documentation of your data to kind of describe what you see in your data, or what you expect to see, and then also what you see in your data. So how do we actually create those expectations? One option is certainly you could write out all these Python statements. Works perfectly fine to say, okay, I'm writing this, and I'm writing this, and I'm writing this, depending on what I know about my data. One of the most common expectations I think that people use is something like expect column value to not be null. Like we know, okay, we want this column to not be null. Usually you have enough domain knowledge to know that. Or expect column values to be unique, for example. So you can write pretty straightforward assertions based on the knowledge that you already have about your data. Another option that's, I think, really, really cool and Great Expectations, and I'm super excited about, is profiling, and we call it scaffolding of expectations. So the idea is basically you take historical data, you run your automated profiler on it. The profiler looks at what kind of data type it is, what's the ranges of the data in this particular column, or if it's a categorical data, what are the values? Is it like a reasonably sized value set? And then it will give you suggestions basically for expectations. So it will automatically create expectations, and it will create the parameters to feed into those expectations. So if I run the profiler, and it actually works, which is kind of cool, if I run our profiler against the New York City taxi data set, against the January data, it will actually give me exactly this expectation to say the value must be between 1 and 6 for this column that I'm looking at. And then what you do with that, right? So you've looked at your historical data, you've created your expectations, and then the next time you want to validate a new batch of data that's coming in, or another data set with those expectations, you can basically throw that expectations at the data set and then get your validation results based on sort of what you've known from your, or determined from your historical data what your expectations should be like. Actually, one thing I forgot to mention is that we don't necessarily believe that data profiling will be like 100% automated thing that gives you perfect expectations, because you always kind of need some amount of domain knowledge to either like broaden ranges or make them a little stricter, or say, okay, right now you haven't seen value X in this data, but we know based on our domain knowledge that value X is also a valid input. So I'm going to tweak this a little bit. So right now the process is basically just why we call it scaffold, as in like it gives you something to start with. But the idea is really for domain experts to still be sort of tweaking those expectations. The other thing is also, this is not like a one-time set and forget kind of process, but just in the same way as with software tests, we envision it to be an iterative process, right? You learn something new about your data, or you make some upstream changes, and you actually also adjust your tests. Cool. Just really quick, I wanted to talk a little bit about different types of workflows that we've seen with Great Expectations, and I think this is one of the things we're currently trying to explain it to a lot of users, because there's lots of different ways you could potentially apply Great Expectations. So one option is to have more of an interactive workflow where we really just import your like the GE library into like a Python notebook. You load a batch of data, like a pandas data frame, for example, and then you just you write expectations against it, and then it tells you pass or fail. So that's one thing where you can profile and validate your data sort of iteratively on the fly. In that case, Great Expectations is more of just like a convenience, like a library of convenience method to do specific tests for you to, for example, check for null values. So you don't have to write that pandas code yourself, basically. The sort of golden path that we envision for Great Expectations that a lot of users use is to get more into batch processing workflows where you create and store your expectation suites, as I said, based on sort of what you know about your data. And then the next time you load new data, you also load the expectation suite and run your tests against it. So it's more of like a batch sort of world rather than the interactive workflow. And depending on what kind of environment you run the tests in, let's assume you run them in like an Airflow DAG, for example, where you do your data transformation pipeline, then you run your tests. The results of your tests could also then determine the remaining behavior of your pipeline. It could, for example, terminate your pipeline and just halt and not promote stuff to production or not build the dashboard. It could continue and maybe just log some of the results. Depending on what you want to do, we've seen different reactions. And depending on like the severity of the test or criticality of the test suite that you have, you could also have different behaviors. So that's sort of the batch processing world, which is really sort of the go-to solution that we're optimizing for. And the last thing that we're starting to see is where we have CI/CD workflows, and G actually gets integrated in at the development stage already. So before your code even goes into production, you could have automated testing, for example, against input fixtures when you open a PR. Abe, should we talk about the thing we're releasing on Thursday?
Up to you.
Okay.
Or you can just like make everybody die of curiosity.
Okay, oh man, this is so hard. So, okay, no, I'm just gonna tell people, and then you can tell yourself like, this is cool. I knew it before it was cool. We are working with a GitHub team with an engineer from GitHub to actually release a Great Expectations GitHub action, which is super, super awesome because you make changes to your pipeline code, push it to GitHub, open a PR, and it will run your expectation suite using a GitHub Actions workflow. So you don't actually need a local deploy of Great Expectations. All you have to, you might need that to like write your expectations, actually write your tests. But basically you have it as part of your CI/CD workflows. And in the same way as if you have, for example, Travis or Azure pipelines or whatever is set up to run your integration tests in GitHub, when you see like the checks, Great Expectations will be part of that, which is so cool that you kind of run your data tests. So just teasing that, there's going to be a blog post and a lot of other stuff coming out on Thursday. So pretty jazzed. But just to give you an idea of like, Great Expectations is really just a library, a Python library to do all these things, and you can put it into your workflow pretty much anywhere you want. Like you can test anywhere you want. This is just a like high-level example of an actual pipeline from a client that we've worked with, where you can see wherever it says GE, the little blue diamonds, we've actually put Great Expectations validation in place. Cool. In terms of integrations, in terms of like what does Great Expectations connect to, it's also one of the things that we've really super excited about and really focused on is to kind of not lock us into a specific platform, like it only works with SQL or it only works with Pandas or it only works with this. But I would say we support pretty much any kind of storage, DBMS, compute backend. We are working hard on integration with orchestration tools. So Apache Airflow, we have a tutorial with an example. We're actually currently actively working on an Airflow operator too for Great Expectations, which is awesome. We have just released an integration with Dagster. So in Dagster, the nodes in the DAG are called solids, and you can have a Great Expectation validation solid in Dagster, and it's actually the output gets rendered in the UI, which is really cool. And then we're also talking to a bunch of others where we're hoping to have some integration. So, but in terms of backends, like anything you can connect to, especially because we're support SQL Alchemy, you can basically throw Great Expectations at it and test your data. In terms of usage, so just showing that it's going up, onwards and upwards, and we've got a bunch of really cool companies that like just pop up in our Slack channel and they're like, hey, we're using Great Expectations too, and that's kind of pretty exciting to see that. A lot of engineers sort of come across it, read blog posts, listen to podcasts, and then just pick up Great Expectations and sort of start implementing it bottom up. That's pretty much it. So we have a Slack channel if you'd like to join. We've got plenty of time. So do we have time for questions? I hope we have time for questions. Hope that has given you an idea of what Great Expectations is and what you can do with it.
I'm going to send in a feedback survey for everyone. So if you have any questions too that we don't get to, feel free to put them in there or come over into our Slack and ask those questions.
Yay.
All right, I got a question. So you were showing the serialization of the expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Where are the functions stored and where are they pulled from? Are they stored where are they stored relative to the project? Is it just like anything importable or like?
Yeah, so that's just the library basically. So what happens when you load a batch of data and then you say, so you have, let's say, a data frame, and then you have your expectation suite as JSON, which basically just looks like this. And then you say, okay, I want to use this expectation suite. You just refer to it by name. We call it data context will basically know which JSON file to look at. And then you say, GE validate this batch of data with this expectation suite. And then Great Expectations will basically parse out the JSON and execute those methods against your batch of data. Does that answer? Is that what you're asking?
A little bit. So I'm a little bit interested in the methods. So there's just a bunch of built-in methods, or you can provide custom methods. Is that sort of the?
So we have about 50 built-in methods that are basically this. I can actually just show the expectations glossary real quick. That might actually be cool. So we have our reference glossary for expectations. So we have about 50 built-in methods that you can run to either validate a batch of data in place and you'll get a result immediately, but it also then, you can also store that expectation as configuration in your JSON file. And those basically just live in the GE like Python library. Oh, this might be like really, really small. So we have built-in stuff. You can also specify, you can create custom expectations. So you can totally extend this with a, let's say, expect column value to be valid US zip code. And you can implement a custom expectation for that. Currently, this is a little complex. You have to touch a lot of code. We're working on a massive refactor to make that significantly easier and basically just have a class per expectation where you can just like basically write your SQL, write your pandas code that does exactly that evaluation and then returns true or false. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Awesome. But we're technically kind of hoping that a lot of the use cases are already covered by these like built-in expectations, and we're getting more and more sophisticated. If you look at like the distributional stuff, I don't even know what this is. KS test p-value. So we're working on like a bunch of more complex stuff too. Especially I think one of the things that's requested a lot is more expectations across tables or across columns. Currently, a lot of the expectations operate on a single column. So kind of cross-column, multi-column stuff is something that's been very frequently requested. That's super interesting, I think, for the future for us. Any other questions?
I have a question. It is related to documentation, the data docs. I wanted to learn what's your vision in terms of documentation. So are you planning to be a single stop for the data documentation that like supporting, I don't know, like this column does this and I don't know, supporting some markdown, things like that? Or is it only a documentation of the tests?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Obviously.
Sure. So what I would say is we think of seeing this documentation as static HTML, I think is the thing that like turns on the light bulb for a lot of people. Like, oh, my tests can also turn into human readable things. But we also do a bunch of other things. So like you can generate Slack messages. The Airflow operator that we're collaborating on developing actually has a like send an email report. So there's nothing like magical about static HTML. We think of it more as being able to render against a bunch of different human readable targets. And because of that, it actually ends up being super flexible. So if you want to use this as sort of a data catalog, you can totally do that. If you have another data catalog that you like and you want to pipe Markdown into that, or if there's some metadata format that it accepts, then you can take your output and push it into that metadata format. So I think being able to see it, like I think the way we think of the vision is it's really important that people think of Great Expectations not just as a testing tool, but also as a collaboration tool to work with domain experts and other people who might not speak whatever code. You know, if you're a Python person, you have to work with a lot of SQL people. It's really nice to have a lingua franca that goes back and forth. We're not deeply opinionated about like, oh, we must own the data catalog or anything like that. If you have something else you like, we want to be able to pipe into that. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
One feature I just wanted to point out is that we do have an option to add text to your data docs or your expectation suite. So this is just dummy text here, but you can basically add explanations or descriptions to your expectation suite and to your individual expectations. So that is possible. I think I slightly disagree with Ape a little bit. I'm like all in on let's make more like data documentation, like let's make it a one-stop shop, because I think it's an awesome opportunity to kind of have your validation results alongside your expectation suites, which is basically your documentation about your data, because it really tells you what you expect from your data, but it also tells you what you observe in your data and what's like actually currently true. And I think that's just a really cool place to kind of make it a one-stop shop.
I totally agree that you want a one-stop shop, like you want a source of truth for this. I'm just saying, if you already have something that you like, we don't insist on replacing that. We want to pipe into that and work along with it. But if you don't have something like that, it's actually pretty transformative to have something like this on your team.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so can we only use the expectation as a complete data catalog? I believe no, right? Because expectations would only populate the columns that we write the custom expectations for. So if you want to consider a complete data catalog for a particular data set, we would need profiling to have all the columns populated on the data docs. Is that correct? Because if a table has 100 columns, we are not going to write 100 custom expectations for that, right? We might write expectations for maybe 10 or 15 important columns, but on the data docs, if we want a list of all the 100 fields so that anyone can know that this table has all this 100 columns. So the only way out is profiling. Is that correct?
Yes and no. So I totally agree that you don't want to necessarily write an expectation for every single one of your columns. Keep in mind that an expectation, again, is just a piece of Python code. So you can totally integrate that in. Like, I've written code that basically just loops over all my columns. It basically just gets the header from my data frame or the list of columns, loops over all the columns, and then depending on the data type, whether it's a string or an integer, it creates a couple of default expectations. So if you, for example, the expect column values to not be null, you can just loop over your columns and then create that expectation for every single one. Or for example, I had a configuration that any columns in my data frame that are integers, I'm going to create a expect column values to be between, and then just take the min and the max of that column. So you can totally, you can totally like generate stuff programmatically. However, having said that, we want our profiles, so that's exactly what we're working on with profilers. We want our profilers to actually be smart enough to just do that for you, so you don't have to implement it. It's totally possible right now to actually, write not even a crazy amount of code to programmatically, automatically generate expectations for every single column. But well, ideally, we'd have that work out of the box in like a few weeks or months down a line. Like, we're pretty actively working on profilers. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Awesome.
I have a question.
Yeah.
To what extent does Great Expectations repair, transform, as well as just check? Because it seems, I mean, whenever I do this kind of thing, I do the kind of check and repair in the same step. And it seems like it would be an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, fantastic question, and we get that question like pretty regularly. So, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. I'll say, like, repairing data is a little bit fraught. Like, if it works, everybody loves you. If it goes wrong, then you just made your data worse. So.
Yeah, I mean, when I say repair, I mean like
isolate broken records, basically.
Well, I'm thinking like, let's say, like stuff that OpenRefine does. Like stuff that
like fixing timestamps and things like that.
Maybe fixing timestamps, maybe just getting padding out, maybe, like turning an O into a 0, or, just that kind of stuff. Like really, really, I mean, I'm not talking extensive, but or if the date is using slashes instead of hyphens, or if it's, month, day, year, well, I mean, forget that one, but, yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff. I mean, so how do you envision that then as being part of the process, or is that
so short version is, we don't currently do any of that in Great Expectations itself. And like Sam said, it's all code. So if you wanted to extend it to do that, like I've actually heard from a couple teams that are doing some version of that. Usually, like the most common pattern that I hear is they'll go through, they'll validate, like you have, in order to do this, you need to be in the pipeline itself. You can't just be running post hoc against data after it's flowed through a pipeline. So you'd like inject this as a node into Airflow or something like that. But typically what you'll hear is a team will build a set of validation checks. Usually I'm hearing row by row there, because it's actually pretty hard to fix data in the aggregate. But you'll do something like call out all the bad rows. The bad rows are then routed through another function. And sometimes that's just like a quarantine queue where they're pulled out for human review. Sometimes like the step that follows that is, oh, we're seeing the same break pattern 10 times in a row and we know we can fix it. Then prior to the quarantine queue, sometimes the people will put a check on it with some kind of fix, like for leading or trailing white space would be a really good example. Yeah. And then those get piped back into the pipeline. So basically what you end up doing is using the output of a Great Expectations validation node to feed into a couple other custom nodes in your DAG. And then, I mean, it's code. You can do whatever you want with it at that point.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and the one thing I want to point out is that Great Expectations does give you the unexpected value. So it does give you the values that violate your assertions. It doesn't give you the actual row, but it gives you the values, so you can kind of go back, query for those create the rows that contain those unexpected values, and then do stuff with it. So it'll get you a little bit there, but not completely. But it's definitely one thing that people talk about a lot. People ask us about a lot. So yeah. Any other questions?
There's a question in the chat.
Ooh, I haven't seen the chat.
Amit says, is it possible? Yeah.
I'm really curious what you mean by that. Yeah, go ahead.
That means in workflow mode, generally you pass on the expectation JSON with the data. It can be vendor data frame, and you kind of validate on that. So now, in addition to that, can I build data docs also? So whatever in documentation, whatever I've seen, generally there you point to the store, Datadog store, or the validation store or expectation store, generally in the context kind of scenario. But in an iterative, when I'm loading the data and calling the G library and then validating, can I build the Datadogs also? That was my question.
So I think I'm hearing you basically describe two workflows. Check me if I'm wrong on this. One is sort of an exploratory workflow where you're looking at data and building expectations. And then the other is a validation workflow where you have new data arriving and you want to store the validation results. Is that right? Or are you pointing at a third workflow?
No, so what I'm saying is, suppose I have, it can be like in Airflow, in workflow, I can have a Python function where I, as a parameter of my function, of my module, I receive the data as a data frame with the expectation JSON. And now I load the G library and then I call and do the validation. And within that, can I create the data docs also without creating any data context?
I see.
I might happily just take a quick crack at this.
Go ahead, James. Yeah, I was about to say, I think you can, but it's not trivial. But yeah.
Yeah, I think so short answer is yes, absolutely you could. That said, I think what you would find is that the creation of the data context is actually very lightweight in that context. If you would like to build your data docs, I would still recommend you spin up a context, even if it's basically an empty or ephemeral context that you're using just to build the docs, because it does a good job of managing for you the orchestration of the parts that you want for where you save and knobs you might want to turn on the built docs. And I think the other thing I'm hearing in there is about the pattern where you're receiving the data in your Airflow operator. So we call that an in-memory data set, and we use the term pipeline connectors for that workflow, which is a little bit like a third workflow to the point that we were describing earlier. That said, from the configuration and data context world, it's a fully supported workflow, and a lot of users work it that way.
So actually I have tried with the data context also. So creating a data context within a Python function where I provide the data docs path or a validation store or expectation store. But instead of pointing it to a directory for the data docs or a bucket in GCP, can I do that in memory without pointing it to some place? So,
oh, I see. Yeah, so it's a good question. I think the answer is yes, you probably could. We actually do have this store called an in-memory store that we kind of use only for this sort of a circumstance. And basically what it would do is just give you back a dictionary with strings of HTML in it. I don't know. That's I would let Sam. I think I would want to. I think you should talk more to Sam and can kind of like think about like the overall workflow, because I mean, from a technical perspective, probably you could, but I'm struggling a little bit to think about like what you really recommend.
Please do join the GE Slack and ping us there if you want to discuss specific use cases. We're always curious to hear what people are trying to accomplish with GE in ways that we've never thought. Or possible.
And sorry, you're getting all this kind of confusion from us. I think there's something going on in your use case that we just don't understand. There's something about your workflow.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's take the party somewhere else and we'll talk about it there.
We'll understand it. Thank you.
Actually, we are also in kind of a exploration mode. So what is happening is we are moving from on-prem data warehouse to GCP. So now at this juncture, we are kind of exploring the GE and what are the things we could do. So this is kind of things I was exploring like past 1 month or so. I'm exploring, and few of the things I have tried, like creating for a TFX kind of a scenario, creating a component, custom component for G and move it around that, Airflow, Python operator. Also, one question I wanted to ask, another question was, is there any documentation for using it for stream like GCP? If we using stream like for PubSub to data flow, is there any documentation available or any direction I can look up to? So if you want to use in that kind of a scenario.
Awesome question. The answer is we've been talking about it. We haven't started on the documentation or anything yet, but it's definitely also one thing. So the question was about streaming data. It's something we want to start exploring, I think pretty soon. So again, like I would please do jump over to the GE Slack and we can like hash out some ideas here. And also just to go back to what you said about moving over to Google Cloud Platform, that's actually Google Cloud Platform, so Google Composer, Google Cloud Storage and all that. We've actually been working on it pretty intensely over the past like month or two. So we've got quite a lot of experience there. So yeah, if you want to ping us in Slack, we can totally.
Actually, I have posted one question, and I think Ben replied.
Yeah.
Saying that creating that within Python function, creating a YAML for the GCP bucket, and got it. Yeah. So yeah, I'll post another question there for the stream, I guess.
Yeah, and like I said, just you can also ping like myself, like you can ping me directly to follow up on this conversation. Cool. Do you see a cat there that's kind of disappearing?
It's like a stealth cat. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So there's another thing that I've encountered before and thought about, like for Great Expectations. Can you? It's sometimes very useful to have like a staging data set, like in stage that is your production but isn't actually your production, like an anonymized data set. Is there any thought around using Great Expectations to generate data?
Oh, that's such a fantastic question. You're all asking exactly those questions that are like, man, this is like really mean because I'm telling you you're not special because we got that question.
But they're the fun ones.
But it's exactly.
It validates me. I think like other people, I'm having similar problems. We're all
data people, and we all have the same problems. Of like, yeah, we would like it to. So, and are you thinking of generating data for a sort of like dummy data, basically, or synthetic data generation?
Yeah, synthetic data generation, essentially to test out pipelines. Right, so like I could generate, this is the expected input data, now run my pipeline through it. I'm going to make a change to the pipeline, make sure it doesn't break.
Yeah.
But I am separating out where I don't actually have production data in my staging environment.
Yeah, we don't, like the answer is we don't have a way of doing that right now. I think it's also one of the things that would be absolutely fantastic in the whole like ecosystem of working with data, testing data, validating it, testing your pipelines. James Ape, I think you had some.
Oh, I was just going to say one thing that's on the medium-term roadmap. So like, don't look for it next week, but before too long. We definitely believe that capturing data snippets is going to be important. And what I mean by that is, let's say that you're running your validation, you get some rows of data that fail to pass tests. But maybe they fail in a non-obvious way, or they fail in such a way that you want to put them in your documentation to teach other people, like, hey, don't send us data that looks like this. They'd also make really good negative test examples for your test suite. So that's a thing where Great Expectations, like especially if you combine it with something like this GitHub action, will be in a good position to sort of grab for you as just part of the workflow. You can also imagine positive data tests in a similar way. So data snippets we actually see as something that we can get to, like not immediately, but we want to do that pretty soon. Data synthesis, where you're like generating new data from whole cloth, that's a much harder problem. It's one that I think is a really interesting one, and like, you know, someday I'd love to take a crack at it, but don't hold your breath on that one, because I think it's a harder problem. It's actually something where there's starting to be some other interesting tools, and we can imagine those being interesting partnerships. Like if they can generate data that matches an expectation spec, that starts to be really interesting.
Cool. Any other questions?
Yeah, hi. So I have a question on, so I've started using Great Expectations like probably a couple of weeks ago. Primarily like here in our company, the data pipeline works in the Glue, using AWS Glue. So I actually read through the Slack messages and all, and I see that some people have actually posted, and I see some message and responses as well, which says that, you know, you are still working, and then it's not fully supported yet. But I'm just wondering, do you have kind of an ETA on, you know, how when will it be available, or at least it can do in like bits and pieces?
Can we take that one?
Yeah, James, we're looking at you.
The ETA is a, you know, such a classically, I'm gonna walk myself right into a trap, I think. We actually do have an existing branch and a pull request that provides that support, but there are a variety of kind of API issues that have prevented us from merging it in at this point. So I think what I would say is I don't have a good ETA for comprehensive support. We just have not been able to bump that up on the priority list. Even though we do hear the question, and as you've said, you're not the first one to ask. What that means, I guess, is I would say kind of two things. One, if you'd like some support in being an early tester, we'd be happy to let you, you know, have at it and really welcome the feedback. Mm-hmm. And then the second is, you know, there are definitely cases where we do provide like more high touch support, and like we have ourselves implemented GE on Glue for other customers. So like, it's definitely something we can do. And we're working towards making it easy to do, but it just isn't quite there yet.
Okay, thank you.
I think are we at time, Caitlin? You're muted, sorry.
Yeah, we're getting pretty close to time. We should probably wrap up. Thank you so much for coming in to the whole Great Expectations team. It's awesome to have such robust support for all of our questions. And thank you everybody else for showing up and listening.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Please do join our Slack and we can continue chatting. Super awesome questions. Thank you so much.